see a life together, standing by you, and I think I want to forever. And after all has come and gone through all the years, I can't believe the moment's finally here. And you never looked so beautiful. You're everything I've waited for, so much more, standing right in front of me. And we go weather every high and low. If love is going where we go to have it hope forever, let's start our life together. Let's start our life together. Let's start our life together.
Welcome, everybody. We're very pleased you could join us for our third webinar, hosted by CHILD, the Center for Holistic Initiatives for Learning and Development. CHILD is a collaboration across four partners: NUS Yung Lin School of Medicine, I probably didn't pronounce that properly, the Lean Foundation, the Singapore Institute for Clinical Sciences, and the Centre for Evidence and Implementation. I'm Robin Milden. I am the Executive Director of the Centre for Evidence and Implementation and a visiting Associate Professor at the School of Medicine at NUS and Interim Co-Director of CHILD, and really pleased to be here. We have three fabulous panelists, as I'm sure our return audience is getting used to now. I'm going to introduce them one by one, and then we will be able to begin some of our questions. So first, it is my great pleasure to introduce Miss Agnes Chai. Agnes started getting involved with social services in the year 2000, although you wouldn't know that from looking at her. It was then she embarked on working with families, groups, and micro-communities. She is currently the Chief Service Officer at Care Corner in Singapore, overseeing a range of services. So welcome, Agnes, and thank you for joining us. Next, I would like to introduce Professor Marilyn Fleur. Marilyn holds the Foundation Chair of Early Childhood Education and Development at Monash University in Australia. She was awarded the 2018 Kathleen Fitzpatrick Laureate Fellowship by the Australian Research Council and was a former president of the International Society for Cultural Historical Activity Research, known as ISCA. I hope I pronounced all of that right, Marilyn. Welcome. Finally, but certainly not least, Professor Bryce McLeod, who is a professor of psychology at Virginia Commonwealth University, a visiting professor of pediatrics at the National University in Singapore, and a clinical psychologist who received his doctorate from the University of California back in 2004. And you wouldn't also know it to look at him either, would you? Never. So welcome to the three of you, and we are really thrilled that you agreed to join us on this panel. The focus and the theme of the panel, as you know, is about translating and implementing good evidence into community services. So, Marilyn, I'm going to start with you, and I'd like to sort of hear a little bit about, maybe a little bit more about yourself, but also in your experience, and maybe even recent experience, share with us a really nice example of effective translation of good evidence into an early childhood setting.
Thanks, Robin, and thank you for the wonderful invitation to join this illustrious panel and to talk about some really important issues. I'm zooming in, which is from Bunurong country, which is the lands on which I'm located at the moment, and that's a tradition we have here in Australia to acknowledge the country from which we're zooming in from. So the whole notion of translation evidence for me has a long history, and but began a long time ago. So I'm a crusty academic and been around a while, and so my research began with a really pressing problem in early childhood education that we've had in the STEM areas, so science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and that is really about how to bring those kinds of really important concepts into play-based settings, because most of the research has traditionally been in more formal settings. And as we know, all of us working in early education settings know that this is a play-based setting is quite different. So for me, the big question about evidence and bringing evidence into practice, so it's taken up really effectively, has been an ongoing passion of mine. And so over 10 years working on this particular problem, we've generated at Monash University an evidence-based model of how to do that, how to bring STEM concepts into children's play. So it's meaningful, so it's engaging, and but it all sits within a particular context. And so the Laureate Fellowship Scheme, that's for those of you who may not know, is probably the premier funding part of the Australian Research Council. And so they've given us funding till 2024 to actually take this evidence-based model and to really explore it in three different ways. One is to because we have three pillars of research that we're taking forward. One is to look at how, and we know this is always an issue, what is the impact of this in terms of children? So how is this evidence-based model actually impacting on children? So how, as infants, as they become toddlers, as they become preschoolers, do the concepts develop over time? And secondly, to look at families, to see how is it that the family pedagogy is bringing about different kinds of conversations based on the intervention. And thirdly, which I'll talk more about today than the other two areas, is actually what does that mean for educators, for teachers, and how do they take forward an intervention or an evidence-based model? Because we know that it's in intervention science, it's very important to look at actually how that's taken up. So it's good to have an intervention, but actually how's it taken up and what do we know about that? And so with the work that we've done, we've been very keen to explore how best to do that. So for instance, the work, because we've expanded from educators in childcare centres and preschools to look at family daycare settings and family daycare homes, I mean, and we've also developed professional development. And we know from the research that if we really want to have application of good evidence, we have to really set up the right kind of conditions for that. And again, like in many fields, early childhood teachers have unique characteristics and unique work environments, different to primary settings and secondary school settings. And we know that there are four main things that really matter for this kind of take-up. We know that online, multimodal, particularly professional development, is highly valued and facilitates really rich professional inquiries with an outside expert and ongoing reflections. We know that that really makes a difference for the take-up of an intervention for teacher professional development. We also know that teachers' motives for why they want to be involved and take on board an intervention really matters, and that they need some kind of cultural tool to support that process. And so in our case, we have a particular model that becomes the cultural tool to support that process of, and we know that dosage matters. And the dosage, when you look at the evidence, is between 40 and 60 hours is recommended for those who work in play-based settings. And this is mostly based on around the complexity, the wiggle room, which is vast, is mostly based on the complexity of what might be the intervention or the problem that's trying to be solved. And finally, what's really quite important is the unique practice context that we're talking about, the play-based setting. But mostly in most of the kinds of interventions that have taken forward in the school sector, there is more of a homogeneous group because everybody has a degree. But in the early childhood sector, we have such a broad range of qualifications, and this also is particularly important. And why I mention that in particular is that we've recently engaged in bringing in family daycare educators into our research, and we're piloting, and I guess this in a way models the kind of essence of what we're trying to do. But we know that the family daycare context is very little research in terms of the impact of quality and how that is taken forward. And but we know that there are very low levels of qualification compared to institutional settings. We know there's high staff turnover, long hours, low status and wages, isolation, very difficult to engage in professional development because they're a single person operator, lots of real complexity. So therefore, this demands a whole new way of operating. So we've set up an educational experiment in which we are actually working to find out, and that's a collaboration between researchers and practitioners. So the collaboration is not just a problem of practice, it's also a theoretical problem. How do we solve this problem of bringing evidence into family daycare so that the interactions between children and the educator, the teacher there, the family daycare educator, is transformed and is able to make use of what is the main evidence. So I wanted to so that's just a really quick plot of where I've come from, where we're going. But I want to show you a very brief video now. It's just over a minute, which is our recruitment video.
Do you want to foster scientific curiosity, develop mathematical logic, and instill design and engineering thinking in children? The Conceptual Play World is a play-based model that can help you do this. It's based on some of the world's best research and inspires young children to form concepts in STEM, especially girls. We want to support you in pioneering play worlds in your preschool, family daycare, school, or childcare centre. You can opt for a 2-hour interactive online session with Laureate Professor Marilyn Flair and her team from the Conceptual Play Lab at Monash University. The session will be tailored to you and your needs. All you need to do is bring along your favourite children's book, stories you and your children will love.
What happened here?
The fox is trying to catch the chicken.
Or if you prefer self-paced learning, there's an option to work through our modules online. They're packed with videos, prompts, and resources to support you. And because it's all online, you can do our workshop or online training from anywhere in Australia or around the world. Contact the Conceptual Play Lab to sign up for your personalised professional development. The Conceptual Play World, where imagination in STEM meets imagination in play.
Excellent. Imagination in STEM needs imagination in play. That is a Twitterable line for sure. And Marilyn, I think also given the topic, it would be terrific if you could share maybe after the webinar. I know there's a report or a piece of research that is going to be put up in the chat for the audience or the Q&A. But it would be also nice to get a link somehow to the body of evidence behind your work. I think you were a little bashful in coming forward about that. So I think if there's a way we could share that with the audience, I know people would be very interested in it. So let me move to Bryce. And for people that have joined us, please post questions as we go in the Q&A. I will be watching that and choosing questions for the panelist as it comes up. So feel free not to wait to the end. So Bryce, over to you. That's sort of a nice segue over into your work, I think, and nice examples of good translation of evidence into community settings in early childhood.
Yeah, thank you. A wonderful example of supporting pre-academics in early childhood settings. And I'll start out by giving a little bit of background on some of the work that our team does in early childhood setting. And I think it's a nice complement because our work primarily focuses on supporting social, emotional, and behavioral competencies in early childhood settings. And so it's a nice complement. So I'm a clinical psychologist by training. Early in my research days, I was primarily interested in treatment fidelity and treatment integrity research, trying to figure out how we could get evidence-based programs to work well in community settings, whether that was outpatient mental health settings or school settings. Here at Virginia Commonwealth University, we are fortunate to have very strong community partners in our work. And after being here for about 10 years, I got together with some good friends and colleagues who I have been doing research with over the last 12 years or so in school settings throughout Richmond. I took my background in treatment integrity research, and we as a team started exploring ways to use practice elements to support the implementations of programs in early childhood settings. And what do I mean by practice elements? Practice elements are a way of reviewing the research literature and seeing what techniques and strategies are common across programs that are designed to support children's social, emotional, and behavioral outcomes. You look at the literature, you code to see what techniques and practices are common across the interventions so that you can identify the practices that cut across programs that have been developed for a specific area. It's an innovative approach that was first pioneered by Bruce Torpeda and Ann Garland in child mental health and has begun to get traction in other areas. And we saw it as a way of potentially making programming for early childhood settings more cost-effective, potentially easier to train and adapt for new settings. And we started to first do that work again in treatment integrity measurement, and then used it to inform the development of interventions. And now we're looking at it as ways of potentially supporting larger scale implementation efforts. So that's a little bit of background and some of the research that we've done, and to kind of talk about an example of where I've seen evidence and community practice work well together. I'm very, very fortunate to work with some close colleagues who have had long-standing relationships with our community partners, both here in Virginia and down in Florida. Some of these partnerships go back for over 20 years. And those partners have come to our team on several occasions and brought a concern to our team, and we've worked together to bring evidence to bear on the question, and they bring their community expertise. And through that process, we have been able to develop programming to support social, emotional, behavioral competencies in early childhood settings, as well as work with community partners to bring elements from the literature to the teachers and principals of early childhood and elementary settings, and together work together to develop evidence-based programs that we have later gone to develop to evaluate the efficacy and effectiveness. And so in my experience, those close collaborations between community partners and scientists who can put together the evidence from the literature with the needs of the community and adapt them appropriately for that context is where I've seen some of the most, the benefit. And it has led to the development of our social, emotional, behavioral programs for early childhood settings. And after that was shown to be successful in the Virginia area, the community partners came back to us and said, we like this program so much, we'd like you to help us develop a program to help with the transition to the next school setting. And so that partnership, I think, is where I've seen the most success of the blending of evidence from science with the knowledge of the community to solve a problem and develop some promising interventions. So thank you.
It's like we planned this, Bryce, because you've given me a really nice opportunity to introduce the audience. Bryce is, in fact, working with child in Singapore as a visiting professor, and is helping us develop up a really exciting, very innovative, in fact, world first trial known as EASL, Enhancing and Screening Early Development to Better Children's Lives, that Child is doing in partnership with ECTA over there. So, and it's a live example of using an elements approach to do a universal preschool program focusing on executive functioning, social emotional development and behavior. And we might come back to that a little bit. But Agnes, it's also a perfect segue over to you, having personally worked with you and the team at Care Corner, knowing quite a bit about the model that you've been developing and leading, and thinking about some of the innovations that you're adding there live in Singapore. And Agnes, also because you have local right of reply, you can add to or develop the ideas from Marilyn and Bryce.
Right, thank you for having me, Robin. Yeah, right. I was hearing Marilyn. In fact, there were quite a lot of similarities that I thought, like, even in a Singapore context, like our early child sector, it can be quite diverse, and in terms of like resourcing, it could be really very varied. And my work has been in the social services sector. Yeah, and for us in Singapore, we do run preschool, like childcare centers, run and led by the social services. But we do also have preschool and childcare centers run by different sectors, like probably the private providers. So it could be a range, and there were those kindergartens that were run by the Ministry of Education. Yeah. So I thought, like, for myself, maybe what I can share would be some of like the journey, maybe in the last few years, in terms of how Care Corner had also been working with different counterparts in putting in some practices in the early childhood sector. Yeah, working with quite many partner preschools in Singapore. We started off in fact, Care Corner started off running 5 preschools. And we also run many family service center. So we work with low-income families. Yeah, and these families, they have their children who spend their day in the childcare centers. And we thought like they really had a lot of needs, and we had to kind of like reduce a lot of barriers for them. But yet somehow things couldn't quite work out, because we thought like by sending social workers to the preschool to help with some family counseling, to provide some like vouchers, that will kind of like resolve some of like the issues related to nutrition, right? Like, or like even in terms of like absenteeism. So we kind of then thought about perhaps what we had thought from one sector, that is the social services sector, social work, family social work, and what we had thought about like maybe early childhood, like, oh, this is what we do in curriculum in the preschool. And then like if we can't put them side by side, they can kind of like just marry off each other, and like things like can kind of like move ahead. But I was totally wrong. Yeah, I had to kind of like ask myself, hey, wow, this not true. It might work for some families, but it did not work for the families whom Care Corner was serving. And they were families who were from like the bottom 10, 20 income percentile, in Singapore. So that's when in 2013, we started to kind of partners like Lin Foundation to set up the Circle of Care project. Yeah, and we were advised like, hey, we got to start small. Yeah, like maybe just 2 demonstration sites, because we have to find evidence, right? We can't like just imagine, okay, whatever we read for textbook, from the early childhood sector, there's like the early years framework. Then from the social services sector, there's a code of social work practice framework. Yeah, so we were quite lucky that we got good advisory to start with, like just 2 demonstration preschool, and were advised to just test 2 or 3 components, not too many. Yeah, so we started to kind of like implement like 1 component in terms of providing family social work services within the preschool, within the 2 preschool, having social workers work within the preschool itself. Yeah, which I would say that is first of its kind in Singapore at that time, 2013, right? And we also heard the preschool saying that there is a lot of learning support that is required for like the 4 years old, the 5 years old, and the 6 years old. So we decided to put in place a second component, that is the literacy and numeracy support element. And after about 2 years, we hear good feedback from parents and also teachers that hey, it's like things seems to be working out better than before, right? Working out better than before. Like the social workers were able to integrate and bring different knowledge and practices together, supporting the preschool educators in terms of navigating family re-situation. And then talking about absenteeism, why the child did not come to school. We got to solve some of like the day-to-day risk issues faced by the parents as well. And so after probably hearing this, we were not too satisfied also. We were also constantly challenged. Okay, this is just like anecdote, right? Like parents, teachers, it's good, really good stories. And I would say that Care Corner, you are quite lucky to have counterparts and of course funders who challenge us. Hey, show us the evidence, right? Then they will say, you got to show me the evidence. You can't like just tell me it's like good stories, yeah, from parents, like how many stories can you put up? So we quite enjoy the journey. So from 2 preschool, we decided, okay, since there are good anecdotes, that give us some basis to scale up to probably supporting 5 preschool. And so in 2015, we piloted the 2 demonstration sites for 2 years. Got some good anecdote, but can't be considered as like clear evidence. So, but good enough for us to get some more support from the preschool that we partner with as well, to also invest time and effort to prepare the teachers and the educators and the educarers from 3 more preschool to come on board to partner us in looking at implementing the component of family social work, the component of literacy and numeracy program into 5 preschool. And of course, newer components came alongside. So with that, we went ahead to also partner like a local research institute, the Social Service Research Institute, to evaluate these 2 components. Yeah, and of course, a couple of others, because we were also asked to bring in the health component, health development of these low-income children from low-income families have been really neglected in terms of the healthcare needs, right? So there, we continued the pilot for another 3 years. Yeah, so from 2015 to 2017, 2018. And from this program evaluation that we partner the Social Service Research Institute, we were able to manage to kind of like provide some good preliminary findings that the family social work component and the literacy and numeracy component have some suggested some positive effect. But we couldn't quite conclude that. It is certain for most of the kids that we work with, probably for 2 specific sub-cohort. Yeah, but we learned a lot from that program evaluation, because it gave us insight about like this approach may work for like 2 sub-cohort, but another 2 sub-cohort did not work, right? And that then pushed us further to wonder, so what's next after 5 years of piloting, right? Because we wanted to scale up to more preschool, so more kids, more preschoolers can benefit from some of the components. So that was when, of course, we get to be introduced to CI, yeah, Robin, yeah, to kind of like get ourselves on board onto this whole notion of implementation science. And so, it's like time passed so fast, right? I think 2018, we started this journey with CEI, until now, to look at how do we scale some of the component from 2 preschool to 5 preschool to now currently 22 preschool. And I would say that these last 3 years of further scaling up does also bring about a lot of challenges in terms of how do we synthesize knowledge, how do we look at barriers of implementation, because I did mention about there are a few components, but what component worked and what component didn't work. So we had to acknowledge and concede that we got to do a small cycle iteration. That means we can do the plan, do study and act, right? We got to kind of try fast, test a small aspect, and then maybe we fail fast. We acknowledge that we fail, but then we try something else again and see what works better. So that was really helpful, and we kind of have to acknowledge that certain implementation in the preschool setting, I earlier mentioned that resources could be very varied, because one approach of implementation can work through a professional development component with the educators, but it may not work the same for some other preschool setting. So the preschool setting in this region versus another region in Singapore would also work differently. So perhaps the mainframe would be similar, because we need to ensure fidelity, but the mechanics of implementation and what evidence do we have to pick up from the small iteration of testing and bringing it back evidence very quickly to inform our social workers, educators, preschool principals, our pediatrician about what did not go on well, what went wrong, but we were quick to kind of rectify and to come back on the same page. So I would say that it's really kind of a progressive kind of journey that we had also been trying to learn about evidence. And evidence not so much in the academic research kind of I'm going to do a very longitudinal study or a primary research, but evidence within the practice setting itself, and also in between practice setting.
Thank you, Agnes. You drew out some really nice themes there. One was around partnerships. Sounds like Care Corner, and you've done a really, really nice job partnering with various groups, because we do need to do this together. It takes multiple players to figure out how to make something work. It also, you've really demonstrated there how context matters, talking about why something might have worked somewhere but didn't work others. And it's really nice to hear the kind of ongoing improvement work that you're doing, likely a little bit of data driven. So it's because it's a challenge. It's a challenge. And speaking of challenges, Marilyn, everybody likes a good news story, but people really, really, really like stories about when something didn't work. And I just wonder, from your experience, if you got a story where you just really tried to get some of your STEM work and it just couldn't either, it was an implementation issue or it was a problem with the evidence, or have you got a story for us about when it didn't work and what lessons you learned?
So there's always many stories about what doesn't work. So I totally agree with Agnes. It is a really big challenge, and I think for us, we know from the research that the STEM area has, in terms of teachers' confidence and competence in the area, in many countries. Maybe Singapore's a little different in that sense, and that speaks to context really nicely, because I guess that's always been a challenge. And I think in terms of our implementation around our model, and has been the big challenge, and to begin with, and which is why we've really worked hard to draw on what we know about the best way to engage educators so they want to do practice change, but also that's one form of evidence around implementation. And the other one is, well, what do we mean by good evidence too? And which is the work that we've done in the past. But what I did want to do was share a story with you as part of our own preparation as academics. So we talk about teachers in the field, like Agnes was discussing, advising, but also what about educators, what about researchers and their own preparations? So one of the things we did in preparation for working towards looking at how concepts develop over time from infancy through to school age in the STEM area, one of the things we did in preparation for that was their whole team went and did the class training, the classroom assessment scoring system. And I know from Robin that this is something that you also use in Singapore. And so we did this, and as a team, because we felt that when we looked at what fed into that, there was lots and lots of fantastic examples. Lots and lots of content that was very much based on really robust research. So we felt really confident that this was going to be the best available evidence. And therefore a really valuable tool that we could take forward and think about in relation to our work. And so when and of course many of you would know that when you become accredited to be able to be an observer, that you get tested yourself, and so that you're looking at the video examples of practices of teacher-child interactions, looking at it in the same way as the developers of class had, in mind, as part of the work, so that it is very robust and strong. And so one of the stories was that. Was in relation to the infant scales. It's probably not the right word for that, but in relation to the kind of videos around language development, particularly where you have things like teacher talk, communication support, communication extension, and looking at infants and knowing that. In the videos, what's valued is the teachers, I'm just reading it from the guides here, teachers consistently describe their own and infants' actions during activities and routines. So I thought, that's pretty straightforward. That's really easy. We know that from a whole lot of research that's really important under language and literacy development. And then when I did the test, watched the video specifically in relation to that, and I looked at an example of a teacher with an infant constantly talking and narrating everything, and it was just so strongly narrated. So this is where we're getting to different cultural differences between Australia and the US. It was so strongly narrated that I thought this poor infant is just drowning in talk, and I rated it really low. And so of course got the feedback that said, you're wrong, Marilyn. You're not a competent assessor here. And so I thought about it and watched the video and thought about it again. Then I went back and had a look at all the evidence. And then I thought, well, the only way that I can pass, because, this is very public, your colleagues are all doing it, and, you're the leader of the lab, and you're supposed to be able to pass these things as well. And so I thought, right, I have to actually think like I'm in a US context. And so what I did was I went through all of the videos and did the assessments, imagining myself in a US context where particular cultural practices like lots and lots of talk really matters, and of course got top scores. But it's not what I would call quality practice for the context in which I'm researching. And so this, I share this story as an example of what Agnes was saying too, which is that you have to look at the local context, and you have to think about, and Bryce was mentioning too, when you're working in collaboration with your partners in practice, there are going to be some off-the-shelf tools which are really robust from the way in which they're created and the context in which they were designed for, and they give really good inspiration, but they can actually skew your assessment in a particular way. And so it's a story. I suppose it's a bit of a long-winded story, I'm sorry, but it's a story to say that, you know, you can have failures just even in a team, trying to bring together all the best evidence. And then you have to think, as Agnes and as Bryce have said, context matters, culture matters, and partnerships are really important to take you to the place you need to go, so that what you do is as a good news story rather than a disaster.
And nice and humble. But that's also an equally nice segue to Bryce and our American colleagues who apparently talk too much. You do. But I know Bryce and I certainly had a lot of conversations about this, you know, examples again, similar to Maryland's, of where things just really haven't worked in our best attempts through partnerships to get evidence used or listened to. So what have you got to share with us from your experience?
I do want to highlight that I think Maryland brings up an incredibly important point, is that a lot of the evidence, and we talk about early childhood settings, is generated in the West and needs to be culturally tailored and adapted and so forth. So raising really important points here that are very relevant to Singapore. So I will say that probably where I feel like there's a lot of room for growth is, and particularly speaking here in the United States, is taking the partnerships at the community level and translating that into changes at the policy level, and disseminating information in a way that when we have research findings, it is packaged in a way that is useful to stakeholders who are in a position to make decisions in regards to programming for early childhood settings. You know, as a scientist, I wasn't trained on how to package my findings for stakeholders or to inform policy. And early childhood settings are often in a position, the stakeholders are often in a position to be responding to a policy where they have to introduce programming to support social, emotional, behavioral competencies or pre-academic learning. And they are asked to put this programming into place, and they aren't always in a position to be able to access the information that synthesizes and puts the evidence into digestible forms that is easy for them to guide their decision making. And so in many of the classrooms that we go in, there is already programming in place in many of these settings. Sometimes they are a great fit, sometimes they're not a particularly good fit. And so where I feel some of our team is still has areas for growth is to figure out how to put our findings into digestible forms that can aid in the decision-making process when stakeholders are in a position to try to access the evidence to get a guide decision-making for their community settings. And I think whether that's an example of taking the findings from some of our programs and using that to help lead to policies that may make those programmings more sustainable over time, or on a broader scale, taking findings across research studies from research synthesis and putting it into forms that can be used as decision-making aids for stakeholders on a broader scale beyond my own local community context. So I will end there.
Very. That's a challenge not only in Singapore but all over the place. We have the similar challenge where I'm based here in Australia. I have some questions coming in thick and fast now, and Agnes, your people are particularly wanting to hear your challenges that you've faced. So I'm going to read a couple of questions, and Agnes, if you could respond briefly to one, well, particularly this one, I think. But there's questions coming in that are often related to how busy early childhood educators are, how demanding the role is, how tiring the role is, and how do we support that? So let me start here. This is from a person saying, love the concept behind the conceptual play world, ! Given what we know about the early childhood educators often being time poor, resource poor, how can program developers work with educators to enable sufficient training and coaching? And Agnes, I'm particularly interested in having you respond to that, given we've worked together around embedding research from implementation science that does speak to how effective coaching is in the setting and how difficult it is to do that in early childhood. So what can program developers, how can they partner with you, Agnes, to enable that? Or what have you tried before?
Yeah.
Or what hasn't worked?
Right. Yeah. Thank you, participants, for the questions. Yeah, I saw them coming in. I probably come like from a point of an end user experience, kind of a starting point. So, like in the work that I do, especially in the last two to 3 years, there's a lot of emphasis on user experience, right? In short, people say UX, right? Yeah, it's not only to the tech world, yeah, or like into the, like profit, like for-profit organization. But I find this particularly important when working with teachers and educators. And like earlier I mentioned, when kind of we thought like we put two together, like different components together, you work. But when we kind of like get the team to work together in the preschool, whether it's social workers or like early interventionists, learning support specialists or pediatrician to come by probably once every like 2 to 3 months, we get to understand the context and environment better. And with that, we understand the end user meaning the teachers and the educators. So end user does not necessarily mean like the children, right? Yeah, so we then got to understand the teachers' curriculum, routines and schedule. And I have to concede that one thing that, I have to concede that my position has moved, from maybe 3 years ago and then comparing now, that I do think that I started out thinking that maybe, we should have like 10 sessions of professional development. But now I do think that we may not need to have 10, for example. Maybe having like 3 would be enough. And I really like what Bryce said about the knowledge synthesis, right? You got to make it bite-sized. And I think Bryce have covered it quite well. The journey, I think, in the last 2 to 3 years, we had been thinking about, if I'm the teacher, right, what would work for me? Like, does having 10 versus having 3 sessions, which one will work better? And I realized that having 3 sessions actually work better than having 10. So I might be missing out, like maybe in my opinion, I want to impart like module 7, module 8, module 9, for example. But I would think that then just imparting that 3 modules would become more effective. And in fact, that's evidence, right? Because it's a lot of iteration that we kind of do very short interview and check in with the teacher to understand the experience and what may work and not what work. But of course, having said that, it is not without challenge, because then who will be the one to do the knowledge synthesis, right? So I think my team and myself, we are very fortunate to have good funders, yeah, and also collaborators who have some resources to kind of put together a team to kind of look into the knowledge synthesis at the back end. So pulling together, there's so many framework that we want the teacher to absorb. Then we say we want the teacher to think about like all this instructional approach. Then we talk about we need to improve instructional design, process design. It's like so much jargon, right? So much expectation. So we had a back-end team to synthesize like how to classify the different knowledge, to filter, streamline, and then classify them in a more effective manner. And I think our purpose is to reduce from 10 modules to maybe 3 modules. So hopefully we can kind of like value add, yeah, even having it value add in a meaningful way, considering the bandwidth tax that educators have. Yeah, I think it's not dissimilar to Australia or other contexts. I read so much about the challenges faced by early childhood educators, the resource constraint, and there were long working hours. Yeah, so that's my experience that I like to cut. Of course, my response to that question lah. So I'm not saying that we have solved this challenge, but it has been something that we had tried and we felt that it is useful. And people like, for example, I would say like for me, right, I come from a technical point of view. Like I may think that we should have A to Z based on a framework, but that really doesn't work. Probably more than half of the time.
Well, it's implementation challenges, isn't it, that you would experience every day? And I can see Marilyn's flagged a very similar question. So again, Marilyn, there's another question here. What are your suggestions in working and collaborating with busy early childhood educators and practitioners who are feeling, this person says, rather tired of professional development, which is a nice example of what Agnes was just saying. If you could respond to that briefly.
Sure. Probably what we had traditionally in the area that I am involved in, what we had traditionally has been intervention models that have been implemented through professional development that have been researched in other contexts, and and therefore it can feel like a chore to participate in something. And but what we've done with our work, because if you remember, I mentioned that we had 10 years plus of working up and developing this model. This is a credit-based model, and I mentioned rather than a deficit-based model. So it's a credit-based model in the sense that it speaks directly to early childhood teachers' experiences and expertise, because it was originally designed in partnership and in collaboration as part of the research process with teachers. So within a play-based setting. So it's the principles that underpin it, and I think it speaks to this idea of the busy teacher, because it's a credit-based model. It works with play. Most early childhood teachers, design very exciting and innovative play-based programs. And the challenge is, how do you actually increase the cognitive load, if you like, if you want to use that kind of language, or how do you engage the children to really become more curious, more imaginative, more inventive as they design and they make and they solve science problems in their play? And that's been the theoretical problem that has brought forward our model. And as a result, because it's been developed with educators in the first instance and piloted, that we have these 5 characteristics. So this is what forms it. And our research is showing, because we're following 3,000, our target is 3,000 teachers across Australia. We have 1,000 that are registered and at different points within this process. So we're looking at reasonable numbers so that by 2024 we can say something sensible. But it's to say our early work is showing that busy teachers love it because it begins with a story, something that most educators, most teachers feel comfortable with. They're very happy to pick up a book and read it to a child or to a group of children. And so we begin with that. But that's the first characteristic, choosing a story that's got full of drama. So we haven't forgotten the social and emotional development at all. Bryce, I'm just mentioning that with your self-regulation and executive functions. Certainly we've actually done some piloting and some research around executive functions and play worlds as well as our model. But anyway, the story that I'm sharing at the moment is that the busy educator is very happy to go along to professional development if all they have to do is take along their favourite children's book. And this is, of course, only the beginning. Once we get them in, we support them to make sure that the chosen books as part of the workshopping brings them, and this is when we do it in face-to-face mode. When we do it online, we have a similar format as well, but we have breakout rooms with people to work with people, so with the teachers, and the teachers will be in different places. So the online mode, as I mentioned before, the evidence says busy early childhood teachers like multimodal online, because they can do it in their centre that evening, afterwards, or they can do it at lunchtime or whatever it might be. So we've kind of built it so built the professional development around implementing the model in relation to what works for educators from the best evidence around professional learning and their own development, but also the characteristics of the model being based on play means that when the teachers and the children go into these imaginary play worlds, so if they bring along the book of Rosie's Walk, for instance, which is the story of a little a hen going around the farm and a fox trying to catch it, which is just a very simple children's book full of really rich prepositional language, going over, under, through, etc., and lends itself to designing and getting a plan view and making a map of the farm. It lends itself to lots of expansion of the academic, as you were saying, Bryce, or cognitive load is increased. But because the children and the teachers are role playing and bringing in drama, so that they have the example of using a mobile phone to say, oh, we've got a message from Rosie's cousin. So setting up a problem, saying, can't find the farm, needs a map to get to the farm. So expanding the story and so on. So we've got really nice, lots of drama, lots of need to engage in STEM conversations and STEM learning and do some research, how to then, make a map, can we use Google Earth to help us, et cetera, et cetera. So so the framework is very expansive, but it is consistently the 5 characteristics in our model that teachers plan. So for very, very busy teachers, when they start to do this with the children, what our research is telling us as well is that the children want to go in these imaginary play worlds. They want to go into and be on Rosie's farm, and they want to use the prepositional language as toddlers and preschoolers, and as part of their role play. And the teachers become fired up because the children are so engaged and it's so much fun. And it's not let's increase the cognitive load by drill and kill. It's actually about having many more imaginative situations where more problems arise. And so the busy early childhood teacher in work we're doing zooms in, has this professional development, tries out the ideas, and then comes back for, and we have a Facebook as well, so we support any problems they have along the way. So we're trying to use social media that's tuned highly, relevant to the educators, because our research, so our marketing people tell us teachers like Facebook, so we used Facebook. So that's the market.
Let's not get into that debate, Marilyn, because I don't know whether that's old or young, but we've only got a couple of minutes left. I just want to get Bryce and Agnes very, very quickly. So, Bryce, if you could briefly describe, I think a lot of what we're hearing today are implementation challenges, and we all acknowledge context. So if you could briefly describe to me, I don't know how you'll be able to do this, so let's see. How is implementation science, what's maybe the top 2 or 3 things it's done for trying to bridge the evidence to practice gap in early childhood?
I guess just to build off of a couple of things that I think a few themes here. And I hope that I'm answering your question here, but I think that there's real space, given that we're still bringing evidence to early childhood settings, and there's a lot of implementation challenges there. I personally think that one avenue would be to continue to use the elements approach. And the elements approach is often thought as a way of making interventions more adaptable to new settings, which I do think has implementation upsides. I also think it can be applied on the synthesis end to develop a common language for elements and outcomes that can be used when knowledge brokers are trying to communicate findings to stakeholder settings. It not only allows us to repackage interventions, I think it provides a new language for us to disseminate findings and connect with community stakeholders. So I think that there's real area for growth there to use elements to synthesize the research literature put it into easier ways of communicating the findings so that we can bring communities and scientists closer together to solve some of the challenges in early childhood settings. Hope that answers your question.
You almost described child just perfectly right then. I couldn't have, and we did not set that up, audience. I have a question here from a person asking if there's publicly available information about the EASL trial protocol. There will be. If you get in touch with the team, we will be able to send you early drafts of where we're up to with the protocol. I think there's contact details on the website. Agnes, you're the local. You get the final word. You have a minute. They are very strict with us. They pretty much kick us out without us. What advice would you have for child or to sort of, partner with groups like yours and others in Singapore, and how can we work together?
Right. I kind of am quite excited, even as last year we had quite a lot of conversations about child, and how we can kind of look at some groundbreaking collaborations and I would say that riding on my earlier point, to be able to probably start from the teacher's point of view. Like the experiences on the ground, probably that would be something that would be helpful, because I guess that to access to that practice environment, that context, that would be the most vital. And our teachers are the ones who are holding the fort day in, day out. And even as I was looking at the whole idea of professional development, wanting to put in place assessment, review, there's so many tools, right, that they have to navigate. And then they will have to look at, are you going to ask me to kind of go through another 2-session briefing to look at how to do this screening? Oh, okay. Then how do this gel with the earlier one, right? So I guess even for myself, I'm not the practitioner on the ground, right? But having to kind of sit down with the teachers and the practitioner would be really helpful. And one thought I have about for us to probably reconsider alongside with our team on the ground across the preschool would be considering how to maybe bring professional development into a level whereby we can bring back more elements of mentoring, and coaching. So I think we are also busy. So our professional development, which we tie in so much to in-service training, right? After pre-service training, you get into a lot of in-service training. And that mentoring probably were invested in the first year of a preschool educators being on board. But I do think that we can look at having this probably provided for the teachers, mentoring and coaching. That can maybe, my wish is that it will help us implement professional development better, and even, bringing in all the practices. I talk about synthesizing knowledge, why 3 modules and not 10 modules. I think there's a lot of common factor that we can draw out from the range of information. Sometimes there's a lot of overlap as well. And I think that's what child is for. Child is to kind of find out all this data point and synthesize.
Yep, excellent. You summed it up beautifully. Thank you. Made my job very easy. Thank you to all 3 of you very much for agreeing to do this. People know me, know that I very rarely give people much prep time. So you've all been very patient and excellent. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Please follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, and other social media channels to find out about our webinars next year. We have a new evidence insight up on the website around eating behaviors that's been developed by some of our research partners. Thank you. All have a very good end of your year, and we'll see you next year.
Look in your eyes, and I can see a life together. Standing by you, and I think I want to forever. And after all has come and gone through all the years, I can't believe the moment's finally here. And you never looked so beautiful. You're everything I've waited for, so much more. Standing